Disappointing people reveal more truth about human nature than loyal people ever will. Loyalty is easy to misunderstand. Sometimes people stay because they love you. Sometimes they stay because you are useful, because you listen, because you tolerate, because you forgive things other people wouldn't. Most people never learn the difference until disappointment forces them to. Carl Jung believed one of the most dangerous illusions humans carry is the illusion of the idealized person. Not because people are evil, but because the mind desperately wants consistency between what it hopes and what it sees. So when someone reveals selfishness, manipulation, envy, or emotional cowardice, the average person does something strange. They deny the evidence. Not consciously, psychologically. Accepting the truth would force them to confront another realization: I was attached to who I wanted them to be. And that realization hurts the ego far more than disappointment itself. Most suffering does not come from toxic people. It comes from the fantasy that they were supposed to be different. You see this everywhere. Once you notice it: the friend who only calls when they need something, the partner who slowly withdraws affection the moment they stop benefiting from your presence, the family member who supports you only when your growth remains smaller than their insecurity. But people rarely accept these patterns immediately. Instead, they negotiate with reality. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe if I become more understanding, more patient, more useful, they'll finally become who I imagined. But reality has a brutal habit. Patterns repeat harder than promises. Eventually, life corners you into seeing people without the emotional editing. That's the moment Jung would call the death of illusion, not the death of love, but the death of projection. Because most people never truly see others. They see unfinished emotional needs reflected onto others. The need to be chosen. The need to feel important. The need to believe loyalty still exists in its purest form. So they create psychological fiction around ordinary human behavior. And the darker truth is this: many people benefit from your refusal to see them clearly. Your optimism protects them. Your empathy excuses them. Your patience delays consequences. Kindness without boundaries quietly teaches people how to use you. That sentence makes people uncomfortable because it destroys a comforting belief that goodness automatically inspires goodness in others. It doesn't. Sometimes it inspires dependency, sometimes manipulation, sometimes silent contempt. Because human beings often respect what they cannot easily control. People sense far more than they admit. They notice who avoids conflict, who fears abandonment, who over-explains, who keeps forgiving long after trust is broken. Then slowly, unconsciously, the dynamic shifts not through evil intent but through human nature. This is where disappointment becomes transformative, because the moment you allow people to disappoint you, you stop needing them to maintain your emotional fantasy. You finally begin seeing behavior without illusion. And once that happens, almost every relationship in your life changes shape. Most people think disappointment ruins relationships. In reality, disappointment reveals the relationship that was already there. The illusion simply dies first. And what replaces it is usually unsettling. Once you stop idealizing people, you begin noticing patterns that were always visible. How some people only become warm when they fear losing access to you. How certain friends subtly mock your ambition disguised as humor. How some relationships survive entirely on your emotional labor, while the other person contributes almost nothing except occasional attention. At first, these realizations feel cruel, not because they are false, but because they destroy innocence. There is a version of psychological maturity nobody warns you about. It is not becoming wiser. It is becoming harder to deceive emotionally. Jung believed the human personality contains hidden aspects, the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge the shadow. Not just rage or violence, but envy, neediness, manipulation, cowardice, and the quiet desire to control how others perceive us. Most people spend their lives pretending these traits belong to bad people. But disappointment changes that. Because eventually you realize something uncomfortable. The people who hurt you were often protecting their own ego the entire time. The friend who betrayed you may have envied your growth long before they abandoned you. The partner who withdrew affection may have feared intimacy more than loneliness. The person who lied repeatedly may not even hate you, they simply feared being seen clearly. Human beings protect identity before truth, almost always. Once you understand that, social behavior starts looking different. Compliments become easier to decode. Apologies begin sounding rehearsed. Attention starts feeling transactional. You begin noticing how often people perform emotions, instead of feeling them, not because humanity is fake, but because survival taught people to wear masks long before they learned self-awareness. That is why disappointment feels so psychologically violent. It doesn't just expose others, it exposes how badly you wanted the illusion. People don't resent your weakness. They resent the possibility that you might outgrow them. That sentence explains more relationships than most people are willing to admit. Because growth changes social balance. The moment you become less controllable, less dependent, less desperate for validation, certain people begin reacting differently to your presence. Not openly, subtly. They become colder, more sarcastic, less supportive, and more passive-aggressive. And if you still carry the old illusion that people who truly care always want the best for you, this behavior becomes deeply confusing. But Jung understood something darker about human nature. People often love the version of you that keeps them psychologically comfortable, the predictable version, the smaller version, the guilty version, the version that never forces them to confront their own stagnation. Disappointment becomes the doorway into seeing this clearly, not emotionally. Structurally, you start realizing many relationships are unconscious agreements. I will remain this version of myself if you remain yours. That's why transformation threatens people, because your evolution silently breaks the contract. Suddenly, your boundaries feel offensive. Your silence feels arrogant. Your independence feels personal. And the disturbing part is that most people won't consciously know why they change toward you. Human beings rationalize emotions after they feel them. First comes discomfort, then the mind invents explanations. That's why some people slowly distance themselves after you heal. Not because healing made you worse, but because awareness made you harder to manipulate. There's a phase that comes after disappointment that almost feels inhuman. Silence. Not outward silence, internal silence. The kind that appears when you stop chasing explanations for why people became who they became. You stop rereading conversations, stop analyzing mixed signals, stop trying to rescue the image you once had of them. And strangely, that silence hurts more than the betrayal itself. Because the mind survives on narrative. As long as you are still searching for reasons, some part of you still believes the illusion can be repaired. But the moment acceptance arrives, something colder enters the room. Clarity. And clarity has very little emotional comfort inside it. You begin remembering moments differently, the joke that felt slightly disrespectful, the fake concern hidden inside advice, the subtle competition beneath friendship, the way certain people disappeared the moment you stopped being useful to them emotionally. At first, you wonder if you're becoming cynical. But cynicism is not the same as pattern recognition. Cynicism assumes everyone is bad. Awareness simply notices that most people are divided within themselves. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He believed people are rarely one unified personality, they are contradictions pretending to be coherent. Someone can love you and resent you simultaneously, support you publicly while secretly competing with you, need your presence while also feeling threatened by your growth. Most social tension comes from this hidden duality, because people say one thing consciously, while their unconscious behavior reveals another. That's why actions often feel psychologically louder than words. Words are edited. Behavior leaks truth. Once you see this, it becomes impossible to fully unsee it. You start observing how often people communicate through implication, rather than honesty, the delayed response meant to establish power, the calculated withdrawal of attention, the strategic inconsistency that keeps others emotionally uncertain. Most people never recognize these dynamics consciously, but they feel them. That's why certain relationships leave you exhausted. Without an obvious reason, your nervous system notices manipulation, long before your mind admits it. And here is where the realization becomes darker. Some people are not attached to you. They are attached to access to your energy, your reassurance, your attention, your forgiveness, your emotional availability. Once access changes, their behavior changes too. That realization breaks something fundamental inside idealistic people, because they spent years believing effort creates loyalty. It doesn't always. Sometimes effort only increases consumption. The more you give, the more people normalize receiving, until your presence becomes expected instead of valued. Most relationships don't end when respect disappears. They end when awareness appears. That's why disappointment often feels lonely, not because nobody exists, but because your perception changed faster than your emotional attachments. Part of you still loves the person. Another part finally sees them. And those two realities begin fighting inside your mind. This is the real shadow confrontation Jung described, not confronting darkness in others, but confronting your own refusal to see reality. Because reality threatened your emotional needs. If you admit someone never valued you the way you imagined, you must also confront why you accepted so little for so long. That question changes people quietly, permanently, eventually. You realize the deepest betrayals are rarely sudden. They are prolonged patterns you recognized early, but emotionally negotiated with instead. And once you realize that, the past starts rearranging itself inside your mind, not dramatically, almost like a slow correction of vision. You begin seeing how many times intuition warned you before reality confirmed it. The hesitation in someone's voice, the envy hidden behind support, the strange emotional distance that appeared whenever you succeeded. Your body noticed. Your mind simply refused to cooperate, because human beings are deeply attached to emotional continuity. We would rather preserve familiar pain than face unfamiliar truth. That is why people stay too long in relationships that quietly drain them, not because they enjoy suffering, but because uncertainty feels more terrifying than disappointment. At least disappointment still allows fantasy. Truth removes it completely. Jung believed this is where individuation truly begins, not in confidence, not in self-improvement, not in becoming admired, but in separating perception from projection. Learning to see people without injecting your unmet emotional needs into them. Most people never fully do this. They continue recreating the same emotional patterns, with different faces, different friend, different partner, different betrayal, same psychological structure underneath. Because the unconscious always repeats what remains unresolved. That's why some people repeatedly attract manipulators, emotionally unavailable partners, or narcissistic friendships, not because they deserve pain, but because familiarity creates unconscious attraction. Chaos can feel like chemistry when dysfunction becomes emotionally normalized. This is where disappointment becomes strangely liberating, because the more clearly you see human nature, the less personally you take its contradictions. You stop expecting permanence from temporary people. You stop confusing attention with loyalty. You stop interpreting inconsistency as a mystery. And perhaps most importantly, you stop trying to heal people who are committed to misunderstanding themselves. That realization alone can save years of emotional exhaustion. Because many people do not want the truth. They want comfort that protects identity. And truth is dangerous to the ego, especially when someone has spent years constructing a personality around victimhood, superiority, innocence, or control. If reality threatens that self-image, most people will distort reality before they abandon the identity. That's why accountability feels so rare. Not because humans are incapable of reflection, but because reflection often requires ego death, and ego death feels psychologically violent. People would rather lose relationships than lose the version of themselves they've emotionally invested in. Read that again carefully. People would rather lose relationships than lose identity. Suddenly, old experiences begin making sense. The friend who twisted every conflict into your fault. The partner who rewrote history during arguments. The family member who denied obvious emotional damage while demanding loyalty. It wasn't always conscious malice. Sometimes, it was self-protection operating at a psychological level so deep that they themselves couldn't fully see it. This is why Jung warned against naive morality. Good people can still cause enormous destruction while believing they are justified. In fact, unconscious people often create the most damage precisely because they never examine themselves deeply enough to notice what they're doing. And perhaps the darkest realization arrives here. The more self-aware you become, the harder it becomes to participate in shallow social illusions. Small talk begins feeling performative. Certain friendships feel emotionally empty. You start noticing how much of society runs on mutual pretending to care, pretending to listen, pretending to support, pretending to be honest. Not always maliciously. Sometimes people have simply become strangers to themselves. When you finally understand that, forgiveness starts changing shape. Not the soft kind people preach to appear, evolved something quieter, colder. You stop forgiving people because you expect reconciliation. You forgive because you no longer want emotional attachment to illusion. That distinction changes everything. Because many people are not suffering from betrayal anymore. They are suffering from resistance to accepting that someone revealed exactly who they were. The mind keeps reopening the wound, hoping the past will transform into a different memory. But it never does. People rarely become painful overnight. The signs were usually present in fragments, small moments, tiny inconsistencies, subtle emotional absences. But hope stitched the fragments together into a false image. Hope can be beautiful, but psychologically, hope is also capable of blinding perception, especially in lonely people, especially in empathetic people, especially in people who secretly believe love must be earned through endurance. Those people tolerate things others would walk away from immediately. Disrespect becomes stress. Neglect becomes confusion. Manipulation becomes trauma. And slowly, they abandon their own perception to preserve connection. This is why disappointment eventually becomes necessary, not tragic, necessary. Because some illusions only die through repetition. The same betrayal, the same emotional cycle, the same realization appearing through different people. Until your mind can no longer avoid the pattern. And once the pattern becomes undeniable, a strange emotional detachment begins to emerge. You stop trying to convince people to value you correctly. That urge disappears completely, because maturity is realizing that misunderstanding is not always accidental. Some people benefit from reducing your worth. It protects their ego, maintains control, preserves emotional leverage. If they acknowledged your value fully, they would also have to confront how poorly they treated you. Many people will avoid that realization for years, sometimes forever. So instead, they rewrite you. You become too sensitive, too distant, too complicated, too intense, anything except accurately perceived. Because accurate perception creates guilt. And guilt threatens identity. This is why awareness can become isolating. Not because you become superior, but because you stop participating in unconscious emotional contracts. You no longer chase approval from emotionally unavailable people. You no longer confuse inconsistency with depth. You no longer interpret breadcrumbs as a connection. And suddenly, certain social dynamics lose power over you. Attention stops intoxicating you. Charm stops impressing you. Words stop outweighing behavior. You begin observing people the way nature observes storms, without personalization, without fantasy, just patterns. And perhaps this is what Jung truly meant when he spoke about consciousness, not becoming perfect, but becoming honest enough to see reality, without constantly reshaping it to protect emotional comfort. Because the human mind is always tempted to romanticize what wounds it, to assign depth to neglect, mystery to inconsistency, meaning to emotional confusion. But clarity destroys unnecessary suffering. The moment you stop asking, "How do I make them finally understand my value?" you begin asking a far more dangerous question. Why was I trying so hard to be valued by someone incapable of perceiving me clearly in the first place? That question changes your standards permanently. Because once awareness enters a relationship, illusion can never fully return. After enough disappointment, you stop fearing the loss of people. You start fearing the loss of the self-respect required to keep them. That's the paradox nobody tells you. The more clearly you see human nature, the less hatred you carry. Because hatred still contains attachment, expectation, emotional investment. But awareness becomes quieter than hatred. You simply stop arguing with reality. You stop expecting unconscious people to suddenly become self-aware because you loved them correctly. You stop expecting loyalty from people whose identity depends on convenience. You stop expecting depth from people terrified of introspection. And slowly, your entire relationship with disappointment transforms. It no longer feels like punishment. It feels like a revelation, because every disappointment removes another illusion, another projection, another emotional fantasy standing between you and reality. Carl Jung once wrote that enlightenment does not come from imagining figures of light, but from making the darkness conscious. Most people misunderstand that sentence. They think darkness means evil. Often it simply means the truth the ego does not want to accept. The truth that some people only loved your usefulness. Some only loved your attention. Some only loved the version of you that remained easy to control. And perhaps the hardest truth of all, some people never actually knew you. They only knew the role you played in their emotional world, the helper, the listener, the forgiver, the one who stayed. The moment you stopped playing the role, the relationship changed, not because you betrayed them, but because you interrupted the illusion. And maybe that's why disappointment changes people so deeply, not because it destroys innocence, but because it destroys psychological dependence on fantasy. After that, you move differently through the world. More observant, more detached, more careful with trust. Not colder, just harder to deceive. And strangely, that may be the beginning of real peace. Because peace does not come from believing everyone is good. It comes from finally seeing people clearly, and no longer needing them to be anything other than what they are.